Hi, welcome to session 3 of the second topic of the semester, dealing with the social and economic transformations of the late 19th century in the United States. So far, session 1 and session 2 have focused particularly on the transformations taking place in the regions of the North, particularly the Northeast and the Midwest part of the country. We were looking at that again in session 1. We were dealing with the second industrial revolution, the birth of new industries, the creation of the modern industrial city, for example, in the North, through the process of migrations and immigrations, particularly by American farmers, African Americans in the South, and also Southeastern European groups that are arriving in great numbers again to take jobs on those cities. We're looking at changes within the city in terms of how people live, for example, the different groups that inhabit it, their ways of life there, their culture, and so on. We're talking about that quite extensively. Their strategies for assimilation, for example, we were dealing with that as well. And also in session 2, we looked at the social and economic changes or transformations in a different region that was also modernizing very rapidly. And this is, again, the U.S. South, the region that actually conformed the Confederacy during the Civil War. I mean, this specifically, we're identifying the specific geographical location again when we mean the South. And we were looking again also at the rapid transition of the U.S. South into the modern age through the creation of massive industries. For example, we were looking at that, like, for example, the tobacco industry, textile manufacturing, steel industry, mining, for example, Coca-Cola company. And again, we were looking at how those industries are changing the way of life of Southern society that was very rural, very traditional, and most people living in the countryside. They were actually farming, producing crops from the land, again, to sustain their families. And now we're going to see the transition in the South. We were looking at, again, in session 2, how that way of life, that traditional way of life, is going to change with the coming of industries, as now Southerners have now an alternative form of subsistence. Again, it's got wage labor economy. They're going to be now employed in the rising industries. There's going to be a massive migration of Southerners into those industrial centers, and they're going to become part of the industrial working class and also members of the middle class as well. So life in the South is changing very rapidly, of course. And there's also farming itself is going to be totally transformed, in that most Southern farmers are going into commercial farming and transforming the use of the land for commercial purposes. And they're modernizing as well their systems of production, introduction of machinery, irrigation systems, etc. So we cover all of that, of course, the building of the railroad in the South. So there's great changes taking place. The South is catching up, so to speak, with the changes that had transpired in the North quite early in the first decades of the 19th century. And now the South, after the Civil War, is trying to catch up with some of those changes, by the way. So in this particular session, session 3, what we're going to do is now look at the third region. We're just going to focus exclusively now on the west part of the country, the Western territories, that is to say. And let me just put the slide here again. So again, the outlines. Again, now this is part 3 of this topic that is going to now deal with the new American West. Just that, as we saw changes taking place in the North, and also changes taking place in the South, giving rise to, again, a more modern industrial society in those regions. Now we're going to shift our attention to look at the West and how the West is going to be transformed from territories in which there was very little or almost no economic development there. And of course, the presence of American settlers was extremely limited. We're going to see transformations again in those territories from just wild nature, nature existing in the raw, in the wild. Again, we're going to see the rapid transformation of this region as is now also being developed and modernized in the latter part of the 19th century as well. We're going to see the rise of a new West. Okay, so we're going to just very, very quickly just look at the Wild West, as it was called, even on the time of the Civil War in the 1860s. Still, many people refer to those territories outside of the formal states of the Union, even though we're talking about U.S. territories. They refer to them as the Wild West in many cases. Again, it was just a way to refer to a region that had not been settled or civilized, because this region was still, again, if you're looking at this map, this region again, in this map, again, the area of dark orange or light brown, was still, again, under territorial status. Again, those have not yet reached the 60,000 inhabitants needed to transform those territories into formal states. So we don't have settlements, of course. There's an absence of towns. There's an absence of settlement. There's an absence of cities. For the most part, the inhabitants of those territories, which today are simply referred as, for the most part, the Great Plains, the Great Plains region, if you will, that you see in this map, were still inhabited by Native American groups. There were about 40 Native American nations that lived in this area, most of which, as we'll see in this discussion, most of whom were actually still living under the hunting and gathering kind of lifestyle, if you will, that mode of living, if you will, in which they were dependent on the hunting of the buffalo and the collection of edible plants, roots, leaves, again, that they collected from, again, their migration. So they're, again, constantly moving from season to season, north to south, south to north, depending on the seasons, because those were the migration patterns of the buffalo. And again, in this region that we call the Great Plains, there were, about 13 million buffaloes, by the way, that roamed freely from place to place in large herds. And the Native Americans were simply, again, following the migrations of the buffalo. And those were not sedentary societies. They were not stationed in any given place, but they, in many cases, claim certain areas as ancestral lands. In many cases, some of them, some of those groups, something that we're going to see, of course, much later. Again, once we finish this topic, we're actually going to talk about the transformation of the Native American groups. So again, this is an undeveloped region. It has not been settled. Once again, there's the absence of American settlements or towns or cities. There are no roads to speak of during this time. There's, of course, pioneers, of course. There's Americans that actually go there. They're adventurers in many cases. They're trying to map the territory or just explore it. Some of them are actually conducting trade. There's trading activities taking place. the so-called Oregon Trail. Of course, there was a trail that merchants will take, traders again, to reach Oregon all the way to the West Coast. And that created a kind of system of roads, if you will, that were extremely limited, from which merchants travel back and forth carrying goods. So there's no systems of transportation either. Again, not yet. Again, there's no railroads to speak of any kind. There are people in the 1860s and 70s beginning to move into this region in order to survey the area and try to not only gain a sense of the region geographically, but also materially, in terms of the material resources that could be used or extracted for commercial purposes, for the creation of enterprises, what kind of land there is in this region. Is it suitable for agriculture? Are there any mineral resources, for example? So again, there are scientists, there are surveyors that are moving there and trying to pretty much gain a sense of the material wealth of this region. And of course, in our popular culture, there's of course movies that talk about the Wild West as the region where the outlaws actually go and take refuge. Those are actually individuals that are coming from the eastern states that perhaps have pending businesses with the law, if you will, and they end up running away from the law, and they go into those territories because there we don't have legal institutions. We don't have towns. We're not going to see, of course, a system of courts and, where people are being tried, etc. They're barely moving there, by the way. Again, they exist in places like Texas, Kansas, and so on. But they have not yet moved formally, again, into the so-called Wild West. There are very few settlements to speak of that have formal laws, particularly when we talk about the border states like New Mexico and Arizona, which were previously occupied and developed by the Spanish in the 1700s, and also by Mexico in the early part of the 1800s. And you're probably going to see some towns that have some form of laws, if you will, some types of institutions there in Arizona and the southern border, of course, in New Mexico as well. But the vast majority of those territories are still very much undeveloped and unsettled. So this is the region that is going to undergo significant change, significant transformations in the latter part of the 19th century, and they will be now fully integrated with the rest of the country, and is going to now, the United States, of course, unify all of the regions. The North, the South, and the West will be totally integrated and unified and work together as a single unit, as a single economic, political unit, that is to say. So we're here to track those changes. We're here to track the changes that transpired in the latter part of the 19th century in the Western territories that give rise to a new West. So we're going to go by stages, by first looking at population settlement, because before we actually begin, describing the kind of economic activities or the transportation systems and so on that are going to change this region, we have to talk about population. Okay, the modernization and the developing of the so-called Wild West started out by first introducing population into this region. First and foremost, again, this first stepping stone, you have to move people over. That is to say, and the people will be now transforming the region by creating enterprises and the like, towns and eventually cities, by the way. So first, population. This is the first stepping stone. And so in this process of change in the Wild West, what occurred is that The United States, of course, in 1862, and this is again Lincoln's administration, Abraham Lincoln, and this is in the midst, by the way, of the U.S. Civil War. So 1862, it is when the Union and the Confederacy were fighting again, and the Civil War. It is at this juncture that the Congress, under Lincoln's administration, decided to open the doors to the American farmers that wanted to reach this region in order to create, of course, farms, commercial farms in this case. So you have to understand the context from which, again, this policy came from. It was known as the Homestead Act of 1862. This is a policy that was legislated by Congress in 1862, by which Congress now opened the doors for the massive movements and outpouring of American settlers, many of whom were actually farmers, to move them by the hundreds of thousands, if not into the millions again, all the way to this region, particularly where we talk again, the Great Plains region. Again, so move as many people as possible. And the background of this policy is that during the Civil War, of course, there was, of course, an issue that had divided the country economically and politically, of course. And, of course, that was the issue of slavery. Okay, so if you took 1301, you're probably aware of that issue. So some of the dividing factors, again, on the issue of slavery that divided the North and the South were the Western territories. And the idea that, divided Americans was that, well, should we allow the introduction of slavery in the Western territories or not? So Southern planters wanted to expand slavery into this territory because they wanted to expand the plantation economy, the growth of cotton. In other words, they wanted to grow cotton again in those regions, and in order to do so, they needed to introduce the labor system that came with a plantation, of course, the plantation system. And that is the system of slave labor. So from the perspective of Southern planters, they wanted to use the lands of the West, those Western territories I'm just describing. They wanted to use those territories for cotton agriculture, plantation agriculture, and of course they wanted slavery to move in there. But Northerners, of course, opposed the introduction of slavery in the Western territories because that will limit the amount of land that will become available for farmers that wanted to open up new lands to the West in order to, again, own their own farms. So Northern farmers that were fighting with the Union, in this case, opposed the introduction of slavery in the Western territories because that will curtail their opportunities to start a new life, to have an opportunity to own land and have their own farm in the West. So when the war began in 1861, Lincoln and Congress agreed that this was the perfect opportunity to close the doors to slavery in the Western territories. Now that there's a war, of course, by simply opening the doors to Northern American farmers living in the northern states to move there as quickly as possible. In other words, so they created the so-called Homestead Act of 1862, which actually awarded land grants. In a sense, they were selling the land, but it was almost like a giveaway. You might want to consider that as a total giveaway in that they were actually awarding plots of land, 160 acres, plots of land to independent farmers. We call yeoman farmers again. Again, the idea is, again, we have to move people, and in this process, we have to settle the Western territories, win the race in terms of slavery and free soil. In other words, we don't want slavery to move in there. So before planters move any slaves there in the future, we have to just move first before them. And also allow the creation of more and more commercial farms in this region that over time are going to become like the breadbasket again of the United States. So that was another, again, visionary idea of Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress at this point. So again, from 1862 to 1900, we're going to see the massive outpouring of American farmers into the Great Plains region under the Homestead Act, many of whom were awarded that land. Of course, there were certain requisites or conditions to be awarded those plots of land, and that is, you have to be in very good standing legally in your own state, no criminal record of any kind. You have to be loyal to the Union in this case, and no ties to the Confederacy whatsoever. But if you met that criteria, you pretty much were awarded that land in the West. So again, a lot of people applied in the northern states, we call it the Union, and many of them actually were given land grants, okay? About 600,000 American families are going to move into this region starting in 1862 all the way to 1900. Again, in that more or less 40-year period, we're going to see the transitioning again of large, groups of people into this region. Of course, they're beginning to establish their own farms. We're going to see the creation of hundreds of thousands of new farms, again, in this region, particularly the Great Plains. Now, also, there's going to be yet another a group of people that are also going to migrate into the Great Plains region, the Western Territories, and they were the African Americans. Again, there are African American migrations into the Western Territories. About 5% of the African American population that lived in the U.S. South after the Civil War came to an end in 1865. We're going to see about 5% of that population. We're talking about that the African American population in the U.S. South was about 4 million. So 5% decided to leave the South. Some of them went up north. We talked about that. They went to the northern cities in search for jobs, about 10%, but 5% went west. So there's going to be also an influx of Southern African Americans and moving into this region known as the exodusters. Those are people that actually left their place of origin in search for new opportunities. In this case, the opportunities for them, again, about 5% of them, the opportunities were presented in the Western Territories because this is where the available land is located. There's also the need for labor. In other words, that in this development that is beginning to take place, as people are moving over, there's going to be the need for labor. Okay, and people are going to be hired there to do certain work, like construction work, for example. There's going to be a lot of construction work in terms of the town that are going to be built. There's going to be roads that are going to be built and so on, bridges, you name it, all that, again, type of work. Agricultural labor and so on. Again, mining, some of them actually see this as an opportunity to engage in commerce as well. In other words, that as you move westward, there's also the opportunity to offer certain services in the communities that are going to arise. And again, there's, like little stores, etc., bakery, shops, and so on. So they see that this is where the opportunities are located. So they're moving there as well. Okay. So there's massive influx of people into this region. All right, so now the second stage for the transformation of this region happened through the development of commercial enterprises, of course, after you move people into the region to settle it and begin things like farming, which is very important. People need to grow their own food, produce their own food to be consumed by the families that own those places, but also, again, there's going to be a national market. And again, that the farmers moving into the Great Plains are going to, and build enough technologies, or they're going to create, again, their farms. They will be able to transform their farms again into the kind of enterprise that will be producing for the national market. So what happens is that after the farmers and other peoples are now pouring into this region through the Homestead Act, etc., is that there's now the development of commercial enterprises. Commercial enterprises that in turn will incentivize more and more migrations, if you will, of other Americans that will be moving there in search for work, in search for commercial opportunities as well. So besides the farmers, we're also going to see, of course, merchants, landowners, investors moving into this region and beginning the process of building enterprises. Okay, so let me just discuss some of the main enterprises that are going to be critical in transforming the Wild West into a well-developed and modernized society, if you will. Okay, so again, commercial enterprises. So we start with mining. One of the very first enterprises that are going to develop here, once again, by merchants, investors, landowners, and so on, is mining. Okay, there were significant amounts of mineral resources that were discovered in some of the western territories like Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, in terms of their silver, copper, and gold. And this is going to lead to the creation of mining camps. Again, the beginning of mining, for example, in places like New Mexico, for example, it was copper. In Arizona, it was, again, silver. And in Oklahoma, it was gold. Also in the Dakotas, for example, in the Dakotas, in that region as well, we're also going to see the discovery of gold, which is going to start the mining enterprise, if you will, in those particular territories that are going to create an economic boom. Okay, there's a mineral resource that is discovered. We need to actually open up a mine. Again, you attract, of course, people, engineers, merchants, and so on that are arriving, laborers, workers, and so on, that are going to start building a mining camp. And over time, as more and more people are pouring in and the mining industry is developing, we're going to see that a simple mining camp is going to transform into a mining town and eventually into a city. Okay, so again, this is not going to occur overnight. It's very, very gradual, but nonetheless, this is how slowly but surely people are moving into this region by the thousands. Again, there are jobs being offered. So you got mining, engineers, mining workers, miners, for example, operators, and so on, that are moving into this region. There's the need for services. So merchants come in and build, shops, grocery stores, and other type of services that they provide to the community, and they have a business going. And again, there's lodging, like we call hotels, for example, that newcomers stay for a night or two. So more and more people accommodate to this growing demand for services. So what we see is the creation now of American towns and American cities in slow motion, if you will, but nonetheless, this is now bringing more and more people over to places like Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and even the Dakotas. Again, we're going to see, of course, that mining was one of the first commercial enterprises that are beginning again to really transform this region. Then, besides mining, there's yet another enterprise, and that is cattle ranching. Okay, and particularly cattle ranching is going to boom in a very significant way in places like Texas, which was already, of course, a state in the Union. But nonetheless, Texas was still very undeveloped for the most part. Despite the fact that it was already a state, there were, of course, plantations there. There were, towns, population centers, and the like. Nonetheless, this is going to transform Texas and modernize it, okay, very quickly. Also, Kansas was part of the Union as well. It's also going to go through significant change, and also the territory of Colorado as well is going to experience a boom in cattle ranching. Of course, there's going to be a cattle ranching boom that will be transforming those territories, those lands of the West. So we mentioned again that this was part of a process, again, that started out at the end of the 1860s and 1870s with the invention of the refrigerator rail car. So we talked about that again in the first session. That made possible for the distribution of beef across state lines. Again, we see the emergence of slaughterhouses, meatpacking industries in places like Chicago, for example. Now you can refrigerate the meat and transport it pretty much to where the people are consuming the product, mainly in the cities of the Northeast, for example. So we saw that. So with those changes that we talked about in session one, that led to the beef industry, what we see is that the growing demand for beef and beef products in the United States is going to cause a boom in cattle ranching, okay? A cattle ranching boom, particularly in Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, okay? The only difference here is that the kind of ranches that are now on the rise, let's say in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s and beyond, are not the typical type of ranches that had existed in the past. And of course, cattle ranching goes back centuries, ever since the introduction of ranching back in the 1500s by the Spaniards in places like central Mexico and their own Spanish colonies in Central and South America, of course. So cattle ranching has been around for centuries, but the ranches themselves are undergoing significant change in that they're now becoming more industrial in their operations. Okay, it's called industrial ranching. And what we mean about industrial ranching is that now those cattle ranches are going to grow in size to house thousands of cattle at any given time, whereas in the past, of course, cattle ranchers actually managed, hundreds of cattle, perhaps 500, perhaps 1,000. But now there's going to be tens of thousands, of course, of cattle that cattle ranchers are going to now handle. They're going to graze, raise, and of course, drive the cattle to the train stations to where they're going to be driven up north to the slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants in Chicago. So this is industrial ranching. Okay, this is not the mid-sized kind of enterprise that had existed in the past. Now there's going to be significant change, because now this is, again, the industrial revolution, which requires new techniques, if you will, new technologies, new knowledge in order to engage in mass production. Again, this is the era of mass production. Okay, the populations of the cities are growing. There's a growing demand for beef. So you must accelerate the rate of production, again, of cattle. Again, so in this process, of course, what cattle ranchers are going to do is import, okay, a particular breed, if you will, of cattle from Mexico that could be bred very easily and will produce large quantities of beef. And that is the Mexican Longhorn. So cattle ranchers in Texas are going to study, of course, different models of cattle ranching and discover that the Mexican model was very, very productive and very, very efficient in that they use one particular breed, the Longhorn itself, that was very plentiful, and it will breed very successfully, and it will breed, of course, large, cattle, of course, that was extremely, large in size and will produce the maximum amount of beef per unit. That is to say, so they introduced the Mexican, not only breed, but also the Mexican model itself of, branding and roping, etc. So they pretty much studied Mexican cattle ranching and were even able to introduce that, of course, into Texas. And of course, it will be adopted in places like Kansas and also in Colorado. And again, this gave to the rise of the modern industrial ranch that was larger in size. When we talk about, for example, the valley, again, in South Texas, again, there were the largest ranches there, of course, in the Panhandle region of Texas, in places like Dallas, for example, as well, San Antonio, Texas, and so on. Again, there were huge ranches there located that were engaged in the massive production of cattle. And again, by 1880, they had already driven about 6 million cattle up north. So there were cattle trails in which, from Texas, for example, and from Colorado, cattle ranchers, what we call cowboys in this case, will drive the cattle across Oklahoma territory into Kansas, where there were actually train stations there waiting for the cattle to arrive. And they will load the cattle on those rail cars only to be driven to Chicago in the Great Lakes region, Chicago, Illinois, where the meat processing plants and the slaughterhouses were located. And from there, they found, of course, distribution across the country. Particularly when we talk about distribution, we're talking about the eastern states, because up to this point, the vast majority of the population in the United States still live in the east part, again, of the country, in the eastern states. So those are the markets. This is, again, where the consumers are located. So it was important now, of course, to be able to ship the product, something that was actually produced in one part of the country, like Texas, for example. Again, this is the valley. The southern portion of Texas was a gigantic, of course, cattle producing region. So something that was produced, again, in one region of the country will find a market elsewhere in the country, again, because now systems of transportation are going to develop very quickly and tie the country together commercially. Something we're going to talk about in just a few moments. Again, transportation systems. But yet there was yet another enterprise that transformed the West during this process, and that is farming and agricultural companies. Okay, so what we see is just like in the Old South, we see the rise of commercial farms and the rise of what is called agribusiness, large agricultural companies that are owned by merchants or landowners or investors, and they're engaged in the massive production, again, of cash crops like cotton, for example. In the Old South, we're talking about cotton, wheat, and corn. Here, we're going to see a similar process in which farmers that are moving into the West will be now engaged in commercial farming, like the homesteaders, for example. We talked about the Homestead Act, in which, again, there are farmers moving into the Great Plains, and they own 160 acres of land, and the farm itself that they own is being turned into a business, into an enterprise. So they're not just growing, corn or wheat to sustain themselves. They're growing corn and wheat for the market, that is to say. So whether we're talking about American homesteaders moving to the Great Plains region, to establish their farms, or they're actually farmers in Texas or farmers in California, for example, the same holds true, is that farmers in California and in Texas are also trying to grow crops for the market. There's also going to be, of course, the emergence of agricultural companies in which we're going to see, of course, the creation of large enterprises owned by, again, a handful of investors or merchants and so on that are interested in growing large quantities of vegetables, citruses, for example, and cotton. Again, California and Texas are going to have the largest agricultural companies of the West, of course. And again, they're growing, again, cotton for the market, vegetables, like great variety of them, of course, and citrus, of course, as well, things like oranges and so on. Again, so once again, the West is changing because there's an economic boom taking place. And that economic boom is attracting populations, is attracting, settlers, is attracting farmers, laborers, miners, and so on, by the tens of thousands. And more people are moving there to work in mines, for example, to engage in commerce and trade. Some are actually working in cattle ranching and also in farming or agricultural companies as well. Okay, so there's significant change taking place in the latter part of the 19th century with the creation of new commercial enterprises. Now, the third stage of transformation that changed the Wild West into a more developed region, a more economically developed region, if you will, is the introduction of modern transportation systems. In this case, we're talking about the railroad itself. Okay, so when we talk about the development of transportation systems in the West, we're talking about, of course, the railroad, and the railroad will now be developed or built at a faster rate than ever, to the point that by the end of the century, there's going to be great development. Okay, railroad lines are going to be pretty much be built across those territories all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and the United States is going to be interconnected. Again, all integrated from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast through a system of railways. Okay, totally integrated, transportation-wise, that is to say. So, again, In 1862, just at the in the very same year that Congress passed the Homestead Act, in 1862, we're going to see that Congress passed another piece of legislation to build a railroad in the Western Territory. So they're opening the doors, of course, for people to pour into this region by the hundreds of thousands or millions through the Homestead Act. And it was necessary that as this is occurring, that they're opening the floodgates, if you will, for the American farmers to pour into this region. And there's going to be, of course, new enterprises that are going to arise, like mining and farming and commercial agriculture and so on, and ranching. It was important to provide transportation access to those enterprises and those settlements, because there's going to be massive production of goods taking place in the West. So it is necessary that those producers, those small or large independent producers, will find a market where the people actually are concentrated, and that is in the eastern states. So we need to build a railroad so whatever is being produced in the West can be shipped to the East. So those products can be processed, can be manufactured, and consumed by the peoples that actually, are concentrated in the cities, for example, and the industrial cities and the ports and all the most populated states of the country, most of which are in the northern region, in the Northeast, particularly in the Northeast, but also in the American South. So again, it's important to link the Western territories with the East. And in 1862, this one was made possible by the introduction of the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. So again, this is an act of Congress, a legislation in which Congress allowed for the creation of four railroad companies, each of which was commissioned a project. Again, it was actually given the project to build a rail line from the eastern states all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That's why they're called the Pacific Railroads, those companies, because again, their mission is to build a rail line all the way across the Western territories until they reach the Pacific Ocean in the West Coast, that is to say. Okay, it's called the Pacific Railroads. So, what are those companies then, the Pacific Railroads? One is the Northern Pacific, and they're given the name after the geographical, location from which they're going to be building the rail line across the West, of course, all the way to the West Coast. So the Northern Pacific, of course, their mission was to build a rail line from the Great Lakes region across the northern segment of the country, through the Dakotas, for example, what today is Montana as well, all the way to Washington State and Oregon as well, all the way again to the West Coast. So this was known as the Northern Pacific. The Pacific Railroads, again, created by the Pacific Railroad Act, in 1862, created four railroad companies. One was the Northern Pacific. The other one was the Union and Central Pacific. And the Union and Central Pacific were commissioned to build a railroad through the central portion of the country. Okay. So the Union and Central Pacific both, again, are working together, if you will, to build a rail line across the midsection, the central portion of the country, the Central Pacific is going to start building the railroad from the West Coast to present-day San Francisco by moving east. And the Union Pacific is going to build a railroad from what today is called Kansas, for example, and Missouri, to move slowly but surely to the west. And the idea is that both companies in due time are going to join their lines again in a meeting point, which they did. Actually, in 1867, of course, in 1867, the Union and the Central Pacific are going to actually join their rail lines in the territory of Utah. Okay. So again, I'll actually just explain that more in depth in just a few moments. But the Southern Pacifics, this is something we discussed, of course, when we were looking at the South, was building a rail line that built a railroad across the South, across some of the states like Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, moving into Texas and moving along the border with Mexico, all the way to California, the so-called Southern Pacific. Again, those were the four companies that were commissioned, again, to build the railroads, again, all across the Western territories. And the idea, again, is not just to build the railroads randomly, but rather that as the railroads are being built across the West, they're going to be tapping some of the most important enterprises that were present at that moment, and also to provide, of course, train stations and meeting points from which American farmers or producers will be able to load their cargoes and ship their cargoes again back to the east. Again, the eastern states, all of this region, again, were the most populated. So when we talk about markets, the most important markets at this point are here, particularly in the eastern seaboard states, the most populated, but also in the Midwest as well. Again, this is most people live at this point. So it is important to provide transportation access to the producers, whether we're talking about fishing industries in Oregon or in Washington State, or mines arising in Arizona or New Mexico, for example, or Oklahoma, or the Dakotas as well, or cattle ranches, again, in Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, or agricultural companies arising in the California area, in Texas as well as the Great Plains region. Again, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of farmers that are now going to have access to transportation so they can ship their produce or their product back to the east, of course, where it's going to be processed in manufacturing plants, of course, industrial plants. So as I mentioned a moment ago, that the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads are going to meet in Utah, in the territory of Utah, in a town called Promontory. And so there, the meeting of those two rail lines really was signaling the beginning of a new era in the United States, because by 1867, there's going to be a transcontinental, let me write it right here, transcontinental railroad that connected the United States together from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. So what that meant is this transcontinental railroad, in other words, across the continent of the United States, we now have transportation that can transport people and resources from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast and vice versa. So now, if people simply wanted to migrate westward, move westward, or travel westward, there's no need for a horse ride anymore. You know, I mean, you can actually do that, of course, if you want to, if you enjoy the ride. But the traditional forms of transportation of the past, again, are now over. Because instead of spending months and months at a time traveling westward, facing enormous challenges and dangers along the way, we can just board a train. And you can board it anywhere in any of the eastern states and end up in California, for example. Okay? After 1867, that is to say, after 1867, at least you can reach to California. So the movements of people is going to accelerate further because now there's a reliable, steady, and very efficient system of transportation that can transport people very quickly. Okay, so this further accelerated the settlement again that started out with the Homestead Act of 1862, and we're going to see now more and more millions of people again moving westward, that is to say. Okay, so very important how the finishing or the completion of this first transcontinental railroad, the beginning of those two railroad companies in Promontory, Utah, of course, initiated a new era in U.S. history, and that is again that the era of the frontier was soon going to come to an end. That very soon there will be no more frontier because more and more Americans are actually settling the Western territories, and there will be a time very soon where Americans will reach and will settle all this territory all the way to the West Coast again. So again, this is something that, again, we're going to cover, of course, in more depth in the third topic that follows after this. So, this is, again, the map that we're looking at, the Union of the Union and Central Pacific here in Promontory Point, Utah. And, of course, now the East and the West are connected. And, again, this was times of great celebration for the country, by the way. Okay, so at any rate, now there's yet two more portions that we have to cover regarding the Wild West. So far we've seen, of course, the Homestead Act of 1862, population settlement, of course, by the movement of farmers into this region. We were looking at the development of commercial enterprises like mining, agricultural, companies and farming, for example, cattle ranching, and transportation systems, of course. But the fourth, of course, stage of transformation of the Wild West occurred through the development of immigrant communities. Okay, the development of immigrant communities. There's going to be, just like we looked at the North, for example, like the Northeast and the Midwest, that there was an influx of immigrants coming from Southeastern European countries, into those cities up in the North. We saw that in the first segment, again, the first session, and also in the first session particularly. Likewise, what we're going to see here in the West is that there is going to be also an influx of immigrant groups coming into certain areas of the West, which will also develop, in many cases, the Western territories in the formation, of course, of communities, of course. Okay, so there's also going to be, besides Americans pouring into this region, like farmers and African Americans and merchants and investors and so on, there's also going to be immigrant groups such as people coming from Mexico. Of course, Mexican immigration to the Southwest is going to take place in a very significant way between 1870 and 1920. There will be about 3 million immigrants. Of course, those are actually peoples that are coming from Mexico, and for two reasons. There's push factors and there's also pull factors, by the way. So again, what is the push factor? What is pushing Mexicans out of the country to come into the United States is that, particularly in 1910, Mexico is going through a very dramatic civil war, which is commonly called as the Mexican Revolution. It was a revolution, of course, in the very beginning stages of this conflict, again, in which, again, the Mexicans are going to actually require some form of political change to take place. In Mexico, the president has been in power for 34 years. By the way, in Mexico, and in 1910, people wanted a change, of course. And that started out the process of the revolution. But after that president stepped down, of course, there's going to be an ongoing fight between different factions. At least 5 different groups are going to be competing, fighting for the leadership of Mexico and certain reforms. And again, that really produced a lot of violence and instability across the country, called the Mexican Revolution, for about 9 years. And in those 9 years, of course, because of the violence, because of the turmoil, a lot of Mexican families decided to leave altogether, and they're trying to get to a safe place, and they're going to actually come into the United States. Again, there will be 3 million again people's coming. One of the push factors is the Mexican Revolution, but also there's a pull factor. There's of course, elements, factors in the United States pulling people into the United States, and that is a labor shortage. Particularly in the Western territories, of course, there is a shortage of labor, particularly when we talk about, agricultural labor and the agricultural companies in California, agricultural companies in Texas, for example, when we talk about mining, for example, in Arizona and in New Mexico, the copper mines, for example, the silver mines, there's also a shortage of labor as well, and also cattle ranching in places like Texas, for example, okay, with the rise of industrial ranches, for example, okay, and mass production, there's going to be the need for labor. And again, the agricultural companies, mining companies, and cattle ranchers are going to open the doors for, again, the influx of Mexican families, Mexican peoples that are moving into this region and search for work, and they're going to find, of course, work in those enterprises. Particularly, again, ranching was very important, and that many cattle ranchers realized that cattle ranching itself was one of the specialties of the peoples of Mexico. It was one of those traits, if you will, that Mexicans are very much familiar with. Some of them are actually raised and trained within ranches themselves, and so they bring a lot of skills, in this regard. And of course, cattle ranchers in Texas find out that Mexican laborers provided very valuable assistance, again, in the formation of those industrial ranches as well. So again, they're going to come in again to the United States in search for labor. They're going to become wage laborers, of course, and in this process, of course, add to the population increase of the Western territories and the states I just mentioned. Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, the border states, that is to say, the vast majority reach those states. Now, another very important thing to note regarding Mexican immigration during this time, about 3 million, get to the United States because of the push factors and pull factors. But what's important is that the people that are coming from Mexico, in many cases, come in groups. This is not to say that all of them come in groups. The pattern. The pattern is that a great many of them actually come with relatives, with family members, or they are coming with members of the same community. People from the same town in Mexico decide to come together and, move into the United States. So when they arrive to the United States, some of the things that they do as a form of adaptation and survival is create or recreate, in this case, their own communities as they existed back home. Okay, so they're coming in clusters, and when they move to places like Texas, whether it's the Valley, for example, in South Texas or San Antonio area, or in California, etc., what they do is that they live together, and they form what is called a colonia, a Mexican colonia. It sounds like a colony, but it's not. Again, what a colonia is, again, is really a part of town in which the people that live there, in this case, the Mexican immigrants, come from a specific town or settlement of Mexico in which they're pretty much recreating it. Yeah, the same type of housing arrangement, for example, they're trying to recreate it. The culture they bring with them, their traditions, their religious festivals. They're Catholic, for example. So again, the Catholic churches are very reminiscent of churches back home and so on. The foods that they were accustomed back in Mexico are recreated here. The little shops that they visited or used again back in Mexico are being opened up. Their medicinal, culture based on herbs and magical formulas for removing spirits, etc. The use of candles and so on, like, religious healers that we call, all of that, again, is being recreated in the United States, what is called a Mexican colonia. So in a certain sense, again, there's a pattern that we see that not only in the American industrial city of the North, we see that with the European immigrants, but also with the Mexican immigrants, is that, again, they're creating a familiar environment. They're surrounding themselves with familiar symbols, familiar sounds, etc., that can remind them of home, so they can adapt, again, to a whole new reality, far removed from the one they left behind, but that provides some form of comfort, if you will, a sense of community that is very familiar to them. Now, of course, besides the Mexican immigrants, we're going to see also Chinese immigrants coming into places like California, for example, in the West Coast. There's going to be about 300,000 Chinese immigrants that will be arriving in the latter decades of the 19th century, many of whom are going to be employed in the railroad companies, okay, like the Central Pacific, for example, the Southern Pacific, the construction of railroad. Okay, a great many of them end up, again, building the railroad. Again, a great many of them, of course. So likewise, the Chinese in California are in the process of creating their own ethnic communities, what today we call simply Chinatowns. This is going to be part of the same process of adaptation, in which they're going to create a community that resembles almost exactly the type of community that they left back home. You're going to see even the Chinese language be spoken there, the attires, the dress styles, and so on, the foods, the religious traditions, and so on. All of them is going to be transplanted in a way that people that go to a Chinatown, it's almost like you're in China. And again, that's the purpose. And the purpose is to make people feel that they have never left their country, the country of origins. So this is another, again, feature of how the Wild West is changing, and this changing because of, again, the creation of ethnic communities and through immigration, if you will. Now, there's one last, of course, checking I have enough time. So one last aspect of transformation, how the Wild West is going to change. And this is the fifth and last one, of course, and that is, of course, the transformation of the Native American societies that inhabited this region and as they're moving into a whole new setting, in other words. So the way of life, if you will, the traditions and so on of those Native American groups are going to change dramatically in a way that they're also going to enter what is called civilized life. But this new stage of civilized life for many Native Americans is going to take place in a very unique way, in that they're going to enter the era of civilization, if you will, in their own terms, if you will. But the way of life, again, of those Native American societies is going to change significantly again. And they're going to be transformed in a very profound way, that their way of life, rooted in thousands and thousands of years of tradition and experience, is going to change, of course, with the transformation of the West. As, of course, there's settlements, there's farmers arriving, there's enterprises, there's the railroad arriving. And of course, this is going to, of course, alter the way Native Americans live. And they're also going to, in a sense, modernize, again, but in their own ways. Again, we're not talking about a total acculturation process, but again, there's significant change in the way people live that is going to disappear. The ways of life of the past, and a new form of living is going to, again, replace the old in this process. For all of the Native American groups, we're talking about 40 Indian nations that inhabited the region that we call the Great Plains, for example, including this territory that is not necessarily part of this geographical region called the Great Plains. Some of the western territories as well, present-day Nevada, Utah, for example, parts of Colorado as well. Again, all of the peoples that inhabited this region, Nevada, for instance, again, all of this region, including the Great Plains, there were about 40 Indian nations that lived in this region. They have lived in this region for thousands of years through the hunting of the buffalo. Again, how those societies actually sustained themselves was by actually moving from region to region, following the herds of the buffalo as the buffalo migrated according to the seasons. So they were actually hunters and gatherers. They were nomadic. They were nomads, in that they were not really living in nested communities necessarily, stationed permanently in certain regions, but rather they travel from place to place, and they survive off, again, the hunting of the buffalo. And again, what we're going to see is that way of life for those 40 Indian nations that they were called is going to change in a way that they are going to make the transition towards a sedentary way of life, in which they're going to create permanent communities stationed in one particular location through the creation of something called the reservation, the Indian reservation. So many of them are going to transition, once again, from being nomadic, from being traveling from place to place, now into a permanent settlement in a specific region, in which they're going to actually learn how to subsist. Other than just by hunting, they're going to develop, of course, other strategies like farming, for example. They're going to learn how to farm and so on. And in this process, live in a reservation. Okay, so there's going to be significant change with the coming of the reservation. But the reservation itself was the process by which those Native American groups, quote unquote, civilized and modernized, but they did that in their own terms, in that they're now going to create their own communities, their own ethnic communities, and in order to preserve their cultures, again, in the reservation itself. So again, one of the factors, again, that led to the coming of the reservation in this region is that once again, because we're talking about nomads, hunters and gatherers, many of those Indian groups conducted, raids, if you will. They raided the newcomers, the settlers, like the homesteaders that are arriving again for the Homestead Act, for example. Many of them reported again that there were Indian raids happening from time to time because, again, there were fears, there were warlike, and there were warriors in many cases. They hunted buffalo. So this was their way of life, if you will. So as we see newcomers arriving to the region, there's going to be, of course, tension in that the Native American groups are conducting raidings, even though they're raiding, of course. The homesteaders, they're also raiding the mining regions, mining camps. Many of them, of course, refuse to leave certain regions that had a specific, special value to them because of their ancestors that roamed the region or perhaps were buried there and so on. And again, that created other conflicts again in which the natives, of course, resorted to raids, of course, in the mining camps were raided from time to time. We got also the buffalo. We talked about that were 13 million buffaloes roaming around this region. And again, the buffalo herds damaged, in many cases, the railroad tracks, wagons, and rail cars, of course, and slow down railroads, because when the railroad was crossing, in many cases, as the buffaloes were moving across the railroad tracks, the train operator had to actually stop the railroads, before it could continue. And in many cases, after the buffalo herd passed, of course, the tracks will be totally damaged. Again, another thing, had to be repaired. So you slow down the process of transportation. I just explained again a few moments ago. And also the buffalo herds affected cattle ranchers. In that, again, what we see is that in many cases where there was a cattle rancher, let's say places like Texas or Colorado, what we see, particularly in places like Colorado, particularly, the cattle ranchers there, what they report is that the barbed wire that kept the cattle inside of the property of the cattle ranch was lost as a result of the buffalo just smashing the barbed wire, the fences, and of course their cattle will be totally lost. They will be roaming around, all scattered in the wild, and it will be very difficult to recover all of that, of course. So again, because of the factors I just explained, the raids on the homesteaders, on those farmers, in the mining region, for example, buffaloes destroying railroads, slowing them down, or the cattle ranchers, of course, there was the need, of course, to develop, of course, the strategy to transform those Native American societies in a way that they were going to develop a different strategy of survival other than, again, roaming around and hunting buffaloes and so on and so forth. In other words, to create Native American reservations or communities, and so they can grow their own food, so they can farm. In other words, there was this idea that they could actually make the transition into farming and agriculture. There was no need, of course, for them to stay in the hunting and gathering stage. In other words, so what actually accelerated the coming of the reservation was that the buffalo hide became so much in demand in the United States that it provided a huge market for the hide itself that led to the devastation of the buffalo in this region. The commercialization of the buffalo hides for the production of clothing, like belts and boots and coats and jackets and so on. People, were very fond of the hide, just like this leather jacket, for example, today, leather boots and so on. Again, similarly, back then, again, they became very popular, the buffalo hide. So the commercialization of the buffalo hide, which created this huge market for this product, led to, of course, the devastation of the buffalo, because now there's hunters, of course, merchants going into the Western territories for the simple purpose of hunting the buffalo in order to remove the hide, in order to sell the hide, of course, to a manufacturer. There will be people that will be sent by industries and manufacturers to a meeting point to pick up, of course, the hide, pay for it, and actually process them into finished clothing and clothing items, of course. So the source of subsistence and the source of the religion of those Native American groups, in which the buffalo was one of the central gods of the society. It was the source of food, therefore the source of life. And whatever is the source of life is called God, again, for human societies. So most of the rituals and most of the ceremonies were devoted to the worshiping of the buffalo, because it provided subsistence or sustenance, food, for people to survive. And also, again, it was the basis of the religion, which was the foundation of their cultures and their way of life. So as the source of subsistence and religion is disappearing, because from 1850 to 1880, we're going to see again the massive hunting of the buffalo. 13 million are going to be killed. And it's almost the extermination of the American buffalo by 1889. Almost. There were just a few thousand left, by the way. It is estimated that there were, by 1890, anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 thereabouts left from 13 million. Again, so this extermination, of course, forced the Native Americans, of course, living in this region to change the strategy of, survival, one that was devoted exclusively to the hunting of the buffalo, to one that will be require the use of farming and agricultural knowledge. Again, those are, the merchants I was referring to, that were waiting for the buffalo hides in a meeting point. And you can see you're probably looking at hundreds and hundreds of those buffalo hides all stacked up in a huge pile, only, again, for a merchant to pick them up, pay for them, and actually just take them to industries so they can be processed into clothing, by the way. So again, this is, of course, leading to the reservation itself, because now the Native Americans are going to now look at the possibility of entering a different stage of life other than hunting and gathering. And again, we see now the coming of the reservation. When you see, of course, the first proposals for reservation, of course, in 1851, when, of course, there were government officials meeting with Indian tribes and Indian chiefs in the northern and southern plains, for inviting them to accept reservations. Of course, in 1851, when there were still plenty of buffalo, again, roaming around this area, the Indian chiefs simply rejected that, because, again, there was no need for that. That's 1851. But by 1887, when there was only a few thousand of those buffalo left, the Indian chiefs are now accepting that maybe this is the time that we have to move forward into a whole new social setting, and of course now accept the invitation of those government officials to sign a treaty, if you will, by which they're going to now agree to move towards reservations, that is to say. And that came with the introduction of an act of Congress, a legislation called the Dawes Severalty Act. Again, that created the Indian reservation itself, of course. So in 1887, now we see the transitioning of those nomadic groups into nested communities that are going to be permanent, and they're going to be settled in specific locations. They're going to be given land, and of course, the ability to make rules according to their own traditions. They're going to be governed by their own norms and values, if you will. And they're going to have their tribal chiefs still making important decisions. And of course, this is going to, of course, move now those societies that were nomadic into a more sedentary or stationary way of life, if you will. Okay, so after 1887, what we see is that among the Native Americans, there's going to be, of course, a religious revival movement that is going to spread across the Wild West with the coming of the reservation, of course. This was known as the Ghost Dance movement of 1890. And what happened here is that as people are leaving, of course, their homelands in regions that they inhabited or roamed around and so on, they're going to be leaving behind many of the graveyards, if you will, that their ancestors were buried. Okay, so they were very preoccupied that access to those burials, to the caves and the mountains on which they buried their relatives, in which they were sacred because they communicated with them. Of course, they established permanent communication with their ancestors. It was important for them. They're leaving that landscape now to live in a community. So in 1890, many of those chiefs and the tribal leaders and the religious figures, the religious leaders of those societies, reported that their ancestors were coming back and presenting themselves in dreams and visions. Particularly, they were having dreams and visions during ritual dances, in other words. It's called the ghost dance because they were not really ghosts. Those were the ancestor spirits that were appearing to them during rituals that involved ceremonial dances. And what the ghost dance movement was, it was that the ancestors were coming back. They were returning to their people in spirit form to announce them that it was important for them to move now into the reservation, if you will, setting. That this was the next stage, if you will, that they were not going to be disconnected from their ancestors if the ancestors will be continue to be worshipped and remembered in the reservation itself. That is, it was important for those indigenous groups now transitioning to the reservation to maintain a link to the past, to never forget about their ancestors, because through the ancestor worship, by remembering and honoring the ancestors, they said, you are going to perpetuate the culture, you're going to perpetuate the identity of the group in this case. Okay, so again, what the whole ghost dance movement was a religious revival in which ancestor worship was now introduced into now the coming of the reservation, and that it was important that inside of the reservation, people needed to continue worshiping the ancestors, not necessarily in the burial sites, not necessarily in the mountain or caves where the ancestors were located, their remains, but rather inside of the reservation. In other words, don't forget about us. Please remember, your past, your history. Please remember your ancestors, because through remembering your ancestors, you're going to remember who you are, as a people. And so the significance of this ancestor cult, this revival religious, movement called the ghost dance movement, is that the reservation is going to now be the space by which those Native American groups are going to preserve their cultures and their way of life and their old religion. They're not going to be hunters and gatherers anymore. Okay, they're not going to be chasing buffaloes and so on and migrating from place to place, but they're going to preserve their unique identity. They're going to preserve their language in the reservation. They're going to be able to preserve their religious beliefs, their ceremonies. They're going to preserve their customs, their norms, and everything that is important to them as a people, as a culture. This is the place by which those cultural elements are going to be preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. So one of the positive outcomes of the reservation, I should say, is that it allowed for the continuity, for the preservation of Native American cultures that otherwise were going to pretty much be scattered and disintegrated if they were not able to live together in communities. Because if no reservation was created, again, the Native American groups will simply be, again, scattered in many directions, and the members will simply be moving into different countries, perhaps in different regions, and they're going to be losing track of their own language and culture in the process. So again, this is a space that provided for the opportunity for preserving their identity. Okay, so this is the end again of this topic. The questions are already posted again on Blackboard at the very end. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is the end again of this topic called the transformations, the socioeconomic transformations of the late 19th century in the U.S. We're going to actually begin a whole new topic on Wednesday. And again, that is going to deal with a whole different theme. I'll announce it again. So when we begin on Wednesday. Thank you. Good night.